I feel like you're a bit of a sensation, maybe on Twitter, on social media. Some of your clips are kind of going a bit viral where you're holding Sadiq Khan to account. More specifically, I suppose some of the clips shown his views on private jets. So what I'd like to know is, since part of your job is working with him all the time, what's your relationship like with Sadiq Khan, and what do you say about his leadership as a whole in London?
It's interesting, this is your question, because Sadiq Khan often mentions my Twitter feed on the chain before. Like, whenever I ask a question, he goes, that's going to go, it's going to go down great on Twitter. So I think my social media is living in his head rent-free. It's quite interesting. And my relationship with Sadiq is complicated, I think, is the first thing to say. I like Sadiq just on a personal level. I think I'm quite proud that we have a mayor who is the first Muslim mayor, that is good on LGBT rights, and that is, I think, a fairly decent and compassionate person. Not all politicians are like that. That might be a surprise. So I think that is the first thing to say. There's been questions that I can't necessarily answer about how he speaks to women, particularly some of the female members of the assembly. I've obviously not been on the receiving end of that, but I think in calling him kind and compassionate, I should also put that caveat that it's clearly not okay if he's treating women differently to how he's treating men. In terms of my relationship with him politically, though, I think from day one when I was elected, I worked in the way that Greens always work, which is to do politics differently. I think people are sick of seeing politicians heckle each other and shout at each other, so I decided to be as cooperative as is possible. So
Which is a radical thing in today's politics, it seems.
For sure, and not always like be looking for an opportunity, but actually where he's doing things right, the opportunity is to amplify that and to applaud it and to say, actually, you know what, on this we completely agree. And I think when we see right-wing forces, particularly around issues of climate, but also around immigration, I think when you've got a progressive mayor, or generally progressive mayor, that is saying the right things, I think it's important to applaud that. However, that is not a kind of get out of jail free card, and it's not a free hall pass. Essentially, where there are gaps in his plans, and I think there's some pretty huge gaps, I also see it as my job to expose them. So we have a pretty strange relationship where some days we have these exchanges and you'd think we were like from similar parties, and then other days where we couldn't be more polar opposite. Because, yeah, you mentioned, I asked him if he would condemn the use of private jets in London, something that is exclusively of the 1%. Now, he was very happy to condemn Rishi Sunak's use of private jets, and I agree with him on that. I don't think anyone should be using a private jet. But he was completely okay with business people, depending on time of day, as he put it, using a private jet. And if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it's saying democracy and our prime minister and the way we run our government is not the most important thing in this country.
And I suppose some people would say, well, that's just a political attack, you know. If you won't condemn rich people using private jets, but would do it against the prime minister, well, you're clearly just using it as a attack against the Tories. I think that might switch people off.
Yeah, I think it's just really opportunistic. And also there's a wider point there too, that if you think business and corporateness is more important than our democracy, then I think that's pretty much the state the Labour Party is in more generally nationally. Like, you see this like huge lean towards just keeping business happy. Now, I'm not anti-business. Small business in particular and independent business has to be at the heart of everything we do, particularly within green politics. But the idea that, you know, we live in a world where 50 of our largest economies are not governments or countries, they're corporations. And I think the fact that we have a Labour government, we're going to have a Labour government, a Labour leader though, and the Mayor of London who are so keen to have those cosy relationships with huge corporations is deeply problematic. And I see it as a huge part of my job to call that out and ultimately be looking at how can we nationalise things? How can we look at that better role for the state and the better role for the public good? Because ultimately the Mayor of London and whoever the future Prime Minister is should be running things for people and planet and not for big business.
Well, I mean, you touched upon the Labour Party and Keir Starmer. We'll definitely talk about Keir Starmer's leadership.
Got lots of things to say.
I'm sure you have.
And about the Tories, to be fair, as well.
Well, yeah, of course.
People sometimes say, why aren't you criticising the Tories more? So can I be really clear that 13 years of austerity has broken right
I get the
now?
criticism to lap. It's, well, you're a Tory enabler. No, it's just that I fundamentally think that if you're against a policy from the Labour Party or the Tory Party, if you sit in the Labour Party, you should criticise it too. Now, earlier this month, we had the Tory Party conference and the Labour Party conference. In my personal opinion, I see the current government, they're pushing extremely right-wing rhetoric, and the Labour Party pretty much are not really in opposition. So in your own words, where do you see the state of politics today?
Well, I think the most obvious thing to say is we're recording this the night after two elections that make it very clear, by-elections, that Labour are going to be the next government. I'm not a betting man, but I just saw as well that I think it's one of the betting companies has put the chances of a future Labour government at 90%. So we're not in like close, people can stop worrying about getting the Tories out. The Tories are going. So the real question then is, what is this future Labour government going to be, look like? What is Prime Minister Keir Starmer? And that gives me partly shivers just to say it. going to be like. And I think we've seen he's going to be deeply authoritarian. He's going to appeal to the right. He's going to cozy up to big business, corporate lobbyists, fossil fuel companies. We've seen him wave through things like the Rosebank oil field. This is an oil field that has the equivalent carbon emissions of 28 of the lowest income countries. That's 700 million people around the world. And Keir Starmer doesn't think it's within his role or need to say, oh no, actually a Labour government wouldn't approve of that. We'd cancel it. And by the way, if he said that today, Rosebank would stop in its tracks because that would create enough investor uncertainty that it wouldn't be able to go on ahead. So where is the state of politics in this country right now? I think there's a very cozy neoliberal narrative where there's this idea that the household budget can be compared to the national economy. And that's complete financial and economic incoherence. And Labour often say there's no money left or we need to stick to our fiscal rules. But the bit they miss from that sentence is they're making up these fiscal rules. So it's completely within their powers to decide that actually we don't need to accept austerity narratives. Austerity has deeply divided this country. It's created toxic rhetoric, a lot of the time refugees, migrants, black and brown communities. They're facing some of the worst effects of these toxic narratives. But Labour, rather than challenging those narratives or creating new narratives, just seems to be okay with doing Tory light, a little bit nicer than the Tories, but never really willing to challenge the status quo. And it's like they accept the country is fundamentally broken, but they don't accept that the solutions we need or the scale and urgency of these solutions are things worth doing. They're offering us this strange mix of cynicism and pessimism.
I feel like we're getting a bit of a mixed picture with Labour. I mean, in one sense, you're getting Rachel Reeves going off to America and doing speeches about trickle-down economics and the role of the state. Keir Starmer even said trickle-down economics is stupid. But at the same time, they're ruling out tax rises for the wealthy, wealth tax. It feels like they're talking up austerity. Public ownership is out of the question. So in a way, I suppose politics hasn't moved because George Osborne, David Cameron instituted austerity and Labour picked up that mantle. So, I mean, do you think that Keir Starmer is essentially a new David Cameron?
I think it's really clear that Keir Starmer is to the right of where David Cameron was in 2010. And for those who campaigned quite rightly against David Cameron, saying, look at where this is going, look what it's going to do to our public services, to the NHS, look how it's going to strip the police services and fire services to their knees, look how it's going to strip back money for local councils. All of those things are now being supported and cheered on by Keir Starmer. And local councils, I think, is a real key one, actually, because that's somewhere which is vital for people, yes, for things like bins and potholes, but also social services, local libraries, things that can really, that equalizes, things that in an era of mass inequality, if you can get those things right, they give people the opportunity to be able to better their chances. Now, local councils can't do this alone, and we need wider systemic change. But if you strip local councils of even those basic services, there is no way social mobility will move. People remain trapped in those poverty traps. And the Labour Party talk about tackling the cost of living crisis. But there feels to be like no intention to scrap the poverty crisis or the inequality crisis. And actually, if you just tackle the cost of living crisis, sure, that's the immediate crisis and that's urgent. People will be able to, put food in their belly and heat in the homes. That's important. But what about being a bit more aspirational than that and looking at a society where people don't have to worry about paying their rent or they can, get a bus or a tube or a train depending on where they live in the world? Like, all of these things are possible, and I'd even move towards conversations around universal basic income and universal basic services, so people have access to all of these things. But the Labour Party just seem content to just talk about poverty, and even that are not talking about in particularly radical or even common sense terms.
Well, okay, so I'll quickly pivot back to the Greens a little bit, because you also had your conference recently, and unfortunately the mainstream media didn't cover you quite as much as the big parties. You're eyeing up 4 seats that you think you could win in the next general election, one in Bristol, my hometown. What's the chance like, Zack?
I think the first thing to say is when I say to people we're going to get 4 Green MPs, people often say, you need way more than that. The Greens need hundreds of MPs. And I just want to say, I don't disagree. I think the Green Party deserve a lot more than 4 MPs. And in fact, in 2017, the Greens got 1 million votes, and that produced Caroline Lucas. Now, she's an incredible MP, and I'm not knocking that for a second, but the fact that 1 MP represents 1 million people, yet just for 20,000 votes, the Tories get an MP for every 20,000, or it might be 30,000. It's something a lot smaller than 1 million. That just points to how broken the first past the post voting system is, and we need to move towards proportional representation. The fact that the Labour Party will attack people for daring to stand, but also support first past the post, shows the hypocrisy that's at the heart of Keir Starmer's kind of
It's
ideas.
unlikely they're going to support it. I mean, I know that the Greens are working with the Lib Dems to try and encourage PR on the debate. You would love to see that happen. Of course, it's better for smaller parties, but Keir Starmer, if he's going to win a thumping majority, why would he essentially vote for something that's not going to be in his interest? I know it's a salient issue, but surely that's not going to happen in the next 5 years with probably a Labour government.
So I challenge even the premise of the question politely, which is that it's good for the Lib Dems and Greens. It's actually good for the country. Like, it is good for everyone that when you go into a voting booth, you know your vote counts as much as someone else who's in another constituency. Now, the Labour Party as a party now support proportional representation. At a conference a year ago, they voted for it overwhelmingly. Initially, the trade unions weren't on board. Now most of them are on board too. So there's this real movement towards proportional representation. But Keir Starmer just bafflingly to my eyes just says, no, I'm not doing that. And the Green Party is the most democratic party. We have one member, one vote. So any member, including someone who joined this morning, could get together with other Green Party members and say, we want this to be party policy. That would then go to the conference. That goes to a straight vote. People can either vote for it and against it. And then as a deputy leader or as the co-leaders of the party, we're effectively spokespeople for the party. So we represent what that collective movement says. The idea that our collective movement would say, we want proportional representation or any policy, and I'd just go, no, I'm overruling that, and I still want you to support me, is so alien to how we do politics. So I think that's the first problem. I think to come back to your question more specifically about the Greens, though, even under this broken first past the post system, we've proven time and time again that local elections we can and we do win. In fact, in just the last 4 years alone, we've over quadrupled our number of seats. Since the last since the last general election in 2019, we've over doubled our number of councillor seats. There's a whole graph that shows our trajectory shooting up, and that looks like it's going to go carry on going that way. Just last night, in 2 council seats, we took seats away from the Tories with thumping majorities. So if we look at Bristol, for instance, there are 14 councillor seats in the constituency of Bristol Central. 12 of them are already Green Party. So that shows if people vote nationally the same way they do locally, that is your next Green MP. Now, there's a fair challenge that lots of people vote differently locally than they do nationally. And that's partly because they go, oh, we think you can win locally, but we don't think you can win nationally. That's entirely in people's minds. So my biggest job as deputy leader of the party and any representative of the party is to say to people really clearly and quite authentically, in fact, totally authentically, we can win this. There is a different way. There is a different way to run this country. There is a different way to handle the economy, a different way to protect the planet. That option is already there. People just need to vote for it. And something I love about Carla Denyer, the candidate for Bristol Central, is she was a renewables engineer before she was a politician. She knew that we needed to invest in renewables and that fossil fuels are essentially killing both people and the planet. But she also knew as an engineer that the obstacles to investing in renewables were not financial, they were not technical, they were just political. So by being that MP for Bristol Central, she will be there every day holding Keir Starmer as Prime Minister to account, essentially making sure that we get a Green New Deal, that we insulate people's homes. That's a triple win. It reduces bills, it lowers emissions, and it creates good green jobs that can also be unionised. We can have that future of a Green New Deal that the Green Party is imagining, along with, much wider movement of the Green movement. That is there for the taking. It just requires people not just to vote for the Green Party, but also to join and get involved.
Do you find that there are certain people you feel like you should be able to reach, but you struggle? And what I mean by that, because I think optics is very important in politics, that the Green Party is seen as just the environment party. So, for example, the Labour Party, the clue's in the name, Labour, the party of the working class, organised Labour, of course, I don't think they're actually represented in the Labour Party more. What about people who just look at the Greens and say they're like a one-issue party? Now, don't get me wrong, the environment, the climate change is the biggest issue humanity faces, but correct me if I'm wrong, but can you tell me, are you struggling, or can you convince people that you're actually the party of workers, not the Labour Party?
Yeah, so I'm going to give 2 parts to this answer. One is more defensive and one is slightly self-critical. I'll start with defensive. I think the idea that the Green Party just care about polar bears and the planet is kind of, I think that's extinguishing a little bit. We really care about polar bears and the planet, so I'm not dismissing that. They're really important. But ultimately, as I've just said, there's no environmental justice without racial, social, and economic justice too. These things are all intersectional, so you can't care about the environment without caring about toxic air in our cities, and you can't care about toxic air in our cities without recognizing the disproportionate effect that has on black and brown communities and also on working class communities. Essentially, the language of austerity and the language of class struggle is the language of green politics when it's all put together and you join those dots. I think it's really important as a party we continue to join those dots. I think where your question is fair is that I think for a lot of the mainstream media, they haven't joined those dots. So I did a debate recently with 3 MPs from different parties. They all got asked quite sensible economic, fiscal questions for their first question. My first question was, isn't veganism a bit middle class? Now, I think the idea that the Green Party is just about veganism or just about being middle class is a very old stereotype and trope, and it's something we need to constantly challenge.
But has that been a problem on the doorstep? Have you had people say that to you, that they think, oh, you're just a middle class party?
Well, I think this is where I'm going to get self-critical now, is the party is not as diverse, not nearly as diverse as I want and need it to be. And I think if we want to be truly representative of the country, we need to be as diverse, as vibrant, as exciting as this country is. Now, I think that's not just the Green Party, that's the Green movement more widely. I think that's politics more widely, actually. Now, we've seen these unusual examples where the Conservative Party and the front bench are probably the most diverse group of people in politics. And that's because they found some black and brown people who are happy, I would say, to throw their own communities under the bus to create toxic migrant rhetoric. And I don't know how they sleep at night. We don't want to do that. That's tokenism. That's just finding black and brown people and making them speak your message. What I'm talking about is deeply embedded politics that goes quite deep, where you don't expect people to come to where you are. You don't expect people to come to your party conference. You go out to community groups, to faith groups, to local youth services. That work takes a long time, though, and that work is happening. But I think we're not going to see the effects of it for a little while. What I would say to people is if they are diverse and they don't think there's enough diversity in the Green Party, that's an exact reason to join. I often hear people say there's no diversity in the Green Party. That's not true. I know lots of people who are neurodiverse, who are disabled, who are black and brown, who are LGBT in the Green Party. And I think when people say that, they are erasing their huge contribution to the party. So there is diversity in the party, but that absolutely needs to be more.
Really glad you said that, though, because I think, like, even with a lot of politics, when we talk about progressive messages, people who are neurodiverse, people who have disabilities are always forgotten in politics, and they're always the one hurt the most when it comes to universal credit, when it comes to benefits. Even under Jeremy Corbyn, there were some people who felt that even the Labour Party didn't look out for those who were disabled. And I'm so glad you brought this up. What can the Green Party do in terms of policy and help shape the narrative that we can't forget these people?
Yeah, it comes to the heart of how you do politics. And I've already talked about a one-member, one-vote system. It has to go deeper than that, though. And that's about making sure whenever you do any policy, you are co-creating and co-designing with people who will be most affected. So that is centering disabled voices, people of colour, again, LGBT people, depending on what the policy is. So to give you an example, I've been pushing for a universal basic income in London. I've been working with community groups, one called Grave Local in East Finchley and one in Jarrow. So they're doing this joint project in two different cities or two different areas. Jarrow is one of the poorest areas in the UK. And in fact, they had the People's March for Jobs back a few decades ago. So I think this is a really good example of where you can be at the front of what progressive new politics looks like. Now, in designing these pilots, they haven't come from politicians. They haven't come from me wading in top down and saying, this is what the pilot needs to look like. This comes from long deliberation and community groups coming together and saying, first of all, the community should be decided by sortitions. So this is a bit how a jury is decided. It's just random who gets involved. But within that randomness, there are reserved places. So there are places for disabled voices, for people of colour, for LGBT people, to make sure that they're bringing those unique perspectives into the co-design. Now, is that enough? No, because if you've met one person of colour or one disabled person, you've met one person of colour and one disabled people. Yeah, I'm Jewish, but I cannot speak for the entire Jewish community. So I think it's important we don't see groups as homogenous, but I do think it's also important we recognise that people come with unique perspectives. And when they come from any minority community, it is incumbent on any politician to make sure that those voices are being heard, because otherwise our policies will continue to be designed in the same way, white middle class way as the white middle class people who have designed those policies. We see this thing with how council buildings are designed, for instance. You have this amazing architecture where women have designed buildings because they've really, I'm talking back in the 60s and 70s, because they've really included the idea of family at the heart of that. You then get men who are not parents and not in families who are designing buildings, and they've just been designed for one person who reflects them. So I think in everything that's designed, whether it's your physical building, whether it's a system that works, or whether it's a political system, it's really important as many voices as possible are continually included in that process. And finally, that it's not, consultation is often notification. Councils or MPs say, I'm going to consult people, but they just tell them how it's going to work and say, do you like this or not? But actually genuine consultation starts with not a complete blank sheet. You should have an idea of where you're going, but you are genuinely listening and willing to change things.
Let's talk about housing. The biggest crisis apart from climate change is lack of affordable housing, rent's too high. Even just getting a deposit on a house is ridiculously expensive. Young people are screwed. What's the Greens' radical plans to tackle the housing crisis?
Yeah, so I think the biggest issue to starting off, is the political system. A third of MPs are landlords. So it's a little bit like asking Turkey to vote for Christmas. So I think we need to recognize the systemic injustice within how politicians are elected. And then we're back to first past the post. I won't repeat myself, but I think it's important in any housing conversation to talk about that. I think second, there needs to be serious conversations about rent controls, rent caps, particularly in overinflated places. I think it's, I was hearing data yesterday from Generation Rent that was talking about bidding wars. So apparently when, just a few years ago, when someone was looking to rent a place, the person who'd experienced a bidding war, the percentage was something like between 5 and 10%. I think it's now over 30% of people, when they are looking to rent somewhere, have experienced where landlords say, oh, someone else is looking to rent this too. And they just keep going up. I mean, that is not, I'm struggling to find my words, but it just doesn't feel like a humane, decent way to treat people and to just, keep fleecing people for every single penny they've got. This ultimately is, partly a problem of supply. So the fact that there is not enough housing, I think a lot of that is guilty of the right to buy scheme. There was lots of social housing that was then sold off by successive Labour and Tory governments. I think we need to end right to buy. I think we need to be really, really proud of council housing. That often gets coded to social housing or housing associations. But I think the simple principle that actually someone can be proud of the fact that they are given a decent home by the council, that is based in a community, that they are treated with dignity and respect, is something that we can all get back to. I think also the amount of empty homes that there are, both in London but across the UK, is nothing short of a scandal. We have landlords who sit on homes that, are just doing nothing.
Just for investment, isn't it?
Exactly, they're just investments. And, I'm always careful that this doesn't get xenophobic, but particularly in London, the amount of Russian oligarchs that have these empty buildings that are not homes, they're not even houses, they're just literally money land banks, of which are often tax loopholes. And I think we need to close all of those things down too. I think ultimately we do need to build more homes, but what we have something called the right homes at the right place at the right price charter. The right homes, meaning that when we're building homes or we're retrofitting homes, they're at passive house standards. So there's no point in building homes that are going to suffer from damp, cold and mold because they're not insulated properly. We already need to insulate every home in Britain that needs it. That's going to be a huge job, a street-to-street insulation program. But we can also get on top of that job by making sure we stop building homes that are crappy and build homes that are a decent standard. The right price I've already talked about, but looking at linking the price of a home to prices of average rents in an area, because we just know, particularly in London, but other cities too, the gap has just got so big. There's no way that anyone can get on the housing ladder. And I challenge slightly the premise that it's not for me to tell anyone who wants to own their own home that they shouldn't own their own home. But I do think part of the narrative has been informed by Thatcher, this idea that you've got to have your own home. And I get why people want that, because at the moment when they're house sharing or they're renting, they're being treated badly by landlords. The house sharing situation is often a nightmare because they're living in an overcrowded home. I think renting can be really attractive. I'm someone who's rented all my life and I've really enjoyed renting. I've had some awful experiences of renting and I've had some good experiences of renting. I think if we could encourage, or not just encourage, but restrict the system to make sure we legislate that people have good experiences of renting and not bad experiences of renting.
I want to pick you on that point there. And as a salient point that I guess home ownership may be a sort of a Thatcherist ideology, I suppose. My question is, and I agree with rent controls. Obviously, I completely agree with building more houses. That's something we absolutely must do. But do you not think that there's an issue at the heart of the system, and that's private landlordism? So I suppose people want to own their own homes because they're thinking, well, I'm just chucking my money away to a landlord. I'm paying for someone else's mortgage. So it might not just be the fact that people just really want to own a home, and I'm sure probably 50% of this country do, but a lot of people feel like it's a necessity because they get ripped off in the private renting sector. Could we see second or third homes banned under the Green Party?
I think it's definitely something that I would encourage and be pleased to see. I think it's this kind of rentier capitalism. I was at a summit 2 days ago, a child poverty summit, and this young woman was speaking, and she was talking about within her community, she was a black woman, that there's just this flame that a lot of her friends have that just can't be extinguished, which is, I need more money, I want more money, I've got to get more money. And she said she kind of interrogates and asks them sometimes, what are you doing with all of that money? And she just said within her community in particular, but I don't think it's restricted to her community, I think this is across almost all communities, is that kind of capitalism narrative that is so embedded in everything we do that people feel like they need to own more, they need to grab more. Now, again, I'm not coming here to smash anyone's aspiration or to say that people shouldn't want a better home or better life for themselves or their family. But I would like to see differing narratives around community, around social purpose, about feeling good about the work that you do, and your compassion and kindness towards your neighbor and towards your community. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily clashes with capitalism. I think there's probably ways to do that where you do put compassion and kindness towards it. Let's be clear, I'm not advocating for capitalism.
I think I was under no illusions there.
But I guess what I'm saying is it's not, people might see that as a wildly radical position from where we are now. I don't think that, I think where I'd like us to get to is quite different to where we are now. But even these basic steps, I think, are things that most people could probably get on board with quite quickly, which is to accept that the housing system at the moment is not working. Capitalism isn't working. Landlordism, as you put it, is not working.
Could we see potentially the state renting out to people at cost price, for example? Because that could surely radically change the private rental sector.
Yeah,
people are not relying on basically enriching some of the people who already own homes or a second home. Maybe the state should rent.
I think that it's really important. And also my colleague Sean Barry, who's running to be the next MP for Brighton Pavilion, has been pushing the London Mayor for something called Buy the Supply. So this is about councils being able to buy what would have essentially been private homes that aren't being used and make them council housing and social housing. If they're there and they're not being used, that's an outrage when we've got people homeless on the street. And I think there's probably not one thing that's going to fix all of this, but I think it's about pulling all of these levers and getting things to change. I think when we look at the London Mayor, he's in a restricted position where there's this huge national problem, the government are awful, but I still think there's things he could do, and not just for mayor, but actually any mayor in any city and local councils, to be more imaginative. So an example with the mayor is the amount of land that Transport for London have that is completely empty. In fact, if you put it all together, there's a space the size of Camden. Should he be looking at using that space, for social housing and again for council housing and making sure we're giving people homes? I think when people are homeless, the first question should not be what are all the barriers and difficulties to making these things happen? The first question should be, how urgently and quickly can we make sure that every single person has a roof above their head, that they can afford their rent? And ultimately, when they're affording their rent, then they're not just putting money into some rich landlord that is getting richer and richer and richer, and the gap is getting wider and wider and wider, but actually that money is being used in a fair and equitable way. And I think that also links, again, I've come back to universal basic income, but lots of things do. So much of universal credit is going to people who are in work poverty, is also going to pay people's rents. So that is the state directly subsidizing and funding private landlords who are often charging too much anyway. And I think the whole system is out of control and needs a huge systemic change.
I have some thoughts about UBI, universal basic income, but probably get onto that maybe a little bit later. But I've actually got a question from a Green Party member.
Oh.
They say you've been accused of NIMBYism, and I know you've got a lot to say about that. You kind of slightly brought it up earlier. What will you do to address these attacks?
I think, as with anything, with an attack, you've got two choices. One, you can ignore it, or two, you can say, I'm hearing this a few times, so we've got to take it on directly. I think we've moved way past the point where we can ignore it. There are so many places we can be building on, so many brownfield sites. There is very little need to be building on the Greenbelt. Now, Keir Starmer has come up with this kind of, I can't remember what he called it, the grey belt, and calling things different names and different slogans. And I think ultimately the problem is this. We have a climate crisis, yes, but even more urgently, we have a crisis of nature and ecological collapse. And it's really important we protect biodiversity and our green spaces. Now, people will often put pictures up of spaces that don't look particularly green or don't look particularly healthy, things like scrubland, but actually very often that land is crucial for biodiversity. People think kind of flat green space with bushes is like the perfect space we need to protect. I'm not talking about necessarily building on that, but actually that is less helpful to biodiversity. That often has animal agriculture on, which is also pretty awful for biodiversity and the climate. The places that we need to kind of grow and allow to flourish the most are those kind of wild places. Now, if we had reached a point where there is no brownfield sites left, there's then clearly a complicated question about the trade-off between protecting biodiversity and building homes. We are nowhere near that space. There is so much brownfield sites ready to be built on that ultimately we need a mass home building program on those brownfield sites, as well as retrofitting old homes, old businesses, old empty shops to make sure they're going up to a proper standard. We often have this short-termism, and I think that's exactly where NIMBYism comes in, is that very kind of, there's no long-term strategy, there's just individual councils hearing the loudest voices and going,
well,
no,
the Lib Dems, I think they scrapped their housing target recently.
Yeah, I mean, they were literally like knocking on doors at a recent by-election to ask people, are there any planning applications in process that you would want us to kind of campaign on? That is sheer political opportunism and literally is the definition of NIMBYism. The Green Party are not doing that. What we are doing is protecting green space where that's appropriate, but also having sometimes those difficult conversations with local communities where we say, we accept that it can't be there, but actually we do need to find a space to house these people. And I think someone I would give as an amazing example of this is Jo Bird, who's one of our councillors in the Wirral. She was a Labour Party councillor and defected to us. I went out door knocking with her in, I think it was March or April. She had the local election in May. She won with over 50% of the vote. She absolutely smashed it. But I was really pleased when we went knocking on doors in the Wirral that I didn't have to say anything before people on the doorstep said, I'm really pleased that that abandoned space that was looking horrible is now being used to build homes. Because essentially we have these spaces in people's communities that feel derelict, that often have graffiti all over old abandoned buildings, feel unsafe for children, like, they might be playing on it, but ultimately it's not safe. And with investment, we can have homes there, which brings with it whole new communities, which brings with it, whole new small businesses, independent businesses rooted in the community. When we go to these spaces, I'm thinking particularly sometimes of seaside towns that just feel so like they've been left behind and there's no kind of purpose there anymore.
I suppose look, I personally don't think you're a NIMBYist party. I mean, you're the Green Party. It would be absurd to not talk about the environmental issues when building, but it must be a very difficult message to sell. We have homelessness. We have a housing crisis. People can't buy a house. People are struggling to pay rent. Surely that is a difficult message to sell.
I don't know if it is difficult because I think, I've given you a long answer, but the short answer is build homes on brownfield sites. Like, that's something I absolutely support. That's something that, people like CPRE, the Campaign for Rural England, supports. That's where there's lots of evidence and data that backs that up. If anyone can present to me that there's no brownfield sites to build on anymore or they're not in the right places, let's have a conversation about that. But until we've dealt with homelessness by building those sites, I think the other very obvious thing to say as well, in COVID, homelessness was dealt with overnight. Suddenly there were no homeless people on the streets because governments and local governments found beds and homes for people to go to. Now, were they always appropriate accommodation? No. So this is not a quick, simple fix. But I think it demonstrated that when you put your political mind to it and you go, let's make this problem go away and let's give people the humanity and dignity they need, that actually you can solve these things relatively easy. What's been lacking is the political will. We come back to the very beginning. A third of MPs are landlords. They don't want this to change. And that's why it's vital we have Green MPs who will be there every day pushing for these solutions.
You mentioned Joe Bird, just to pivot a little bit. You mentioned Joe Bird. I feel like politics is becoming quite McCarthyite. There's a lot of attacks being thrown around. Joe Bird has been on the end of attacks from the Labour Party. What is your response to that and how the Labour Party have acted since Joe Bird used to be in the party?
Yeah, so I think there's a few responses to this. The first is, organisations within the Labour movement writing to the Green Party to tell us how to run our internal procedures. I think it's quite clear to anyone who has any kind of ounce of decency or fairness that it's up to a political party how they run their political party. And I think the idea that the Labour Party would think that we were going to take advice or guidance from the Labour Party would seem quite alien. I'm not even going to comment about how they run their party because, again, we're different parties, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do. I think when I think about politics more widely at the moment, there's not enough words to condemn this government's response to what's happening in Israel and Palestine right now. I think that, Rishi Sunak says, we want you to win. No one's winning here. Death is the only thing that's winning here. And I think it's important that any politician condemns every single innocent civilian who is dying. I think it's also really clear that we need to call for an immediate ceasefire. We also need to end the occupation. Now, I think you can totally recognize that the brutality of Hamas's attack, there is no justification for that. There is no apology for that. That needs to be condemned in the strongest possible terms as the brutal, barbaric attack it was. And you can also recognize that there is a history to the occupation of Palestine by the Israeli government, the far-right Israeli government, which does not represent the majority of Israelis in the same way that Hamas does not represent the majority of Palestinians.
I mean, I was going to ask you about this question. I'm glad you brought it up, which is it feels like you've got Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, front bench, are essentially backing Israel regardless. And I feel like what they're doing is collective punishment. B'Tselem, Amnesty, lots of human rights organizations will call this war crimes. So, again, I know you started talking about it, but what is your response when you hear our leaders say this? And what about Palestinian people, not just in Palestine, but over here in this country? I mean, we're seeing right-wing commentators conflate Palestinians with Hamas. I mean, we've had people protesting for Palestinian rights. What's the Green Party's view on this?
There's a real visceral feeling of sickness around this whole thing. The fact that Rishi Sunak, it won't surprise you to know that I don't support him or voted for him, does essentially represent our country as Prime Minister. And to see him stood side by side with a far-right leader, and let's be very clear, that's what Netanyahu is, and say, we stand with you when they're enacting this collective punishment is horrific and does need to be condemned. I think the idea that the Palestinians are in any way responsible for what Hamas did on October the 7th is not tenable. And then the idea that even if Palestinians did support it, which the vast majority of them don't, the idea that when the majority of that population are children, they should be kept in this essentially open-air prison and food, water, fuel, resources cut off from them. There aren't a lot of words for it other than absolutely deplorable. The fact that Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry, human rights lawyers, so these are not people who speak off the cuff or speak casually, went on LBC. Nick Ferrari asked him very directly if he stood by Israel's decision to not allow food, water into Gaza. He said at the time that he stood with Israel. A few days later, he's seen the backlash that's happening. If he apologized, I would still have huge contempt for how Keir Starmer's handled this, but he's not even apologized. He's just gaslit us. He said, no, that's not what I've said. But it takes 30 seconds for anyone to Google what he said and see very clear that the question was very clear and his answer was very clear. I think the majority of people in this country will have seen the Conservative and the Labour leadership reaction to what is more than a humanitarian crisis that has been going on for a long time. And ultimately, an immediate ceasefire is the very bare minimum that needs to happen. We need to stop the violence. Every death that is happening is a tragedy. We also need to be clear that a ceasefire is not going to be the end of this conflict. We frankly can't trust either side, or I wouldn't say side, but either Hamas or the Israeli government with this. We know that a ceasefire might last 5-10 minutes. An immediate ceasefire needs to happen as quickly as possible because we need people to stop dying, but then there needs to be every sinew, every moment of diplomatic efforts to get around the negotiating table. There isn't even a negotiating table at this point. And the fact that the UK have not been more vocal, along with America and along with other countries, in saying we need a peace settlement for Israel and Palestine.
What does it say about the state of this country? I agree with everything you say about it. I don't think it's a controversial statement. Yet that in itself seems to be controversial. You're getting attacked. There's a lot of people in the mainstream media who feel like they want to just condemn Hamas, which we all should. But the idea that you start talking about Palestinian people, and then there seems to be a lot of anger and furor in there. Are Muslims and Palestinians, they're not treated as equal, are they? According to the establishment, they're seen as lesser.
No, they're not. The narrative definitely seems that Israeli blood is more important than Palestinian blood. Now, I'm Jewish. I'm one of the very few Jewish people who have been in leadership positions in British politics, and that's a responsibility I take really seriously. And I can't say this in more clear and coherent words. Anti-Semitism is not acceptable. That affects both me, it affects my family, and it affects communities. And at the same time, Islamophobia is totally not acceptable. And these are two sides of the same coin. It serves people who want to divide and rule communities to try and put Jews and Muslims, particularly British Jews and Muslims, against each other and try and create some kind of narrative that this is about Israelis versus Palestinians. This is not that narrative, and I think the protests we're seeing in Israeli streets every single day demonstrate that is not what is going on here. Again, what is going on here is that Hamas, who are not adequately representing the Palestinians, and Netanyahu, who is not adequately representing the Israelis, are stoking up tension in the Middle East, which has reverberations to what happens in the UK. Now, I'm always the first to say that just because I'm Jewish, I'm not a spokesperson for Israel in any way. That being said, there is also a link between being Jewish and the Jewish homeland, and there is a link between being Muslim in this country and being concerned for the plight of the Palestinians. So these things cannot be divorced from each other, but I think it's also really important that people are very clear what we're talking about when we have these conversations. And as a bare minimum, that anyone who is Jewish or Muslim who is in public life says consistently and clearly that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are totally unacceptable.
I agree. I want to ask you about transphobia. And I feel like this question isn't addressed enough. And that's all political parties. I feel like the mainstream media, the hate campaign for the mainstream media is so deafening and it's worrying. The Green Party have had issues with transphobia before. You had leadership candidates as recently as 2021 saying some transphobic remarks. Is the Green Party a home for trans people? Is it a safe space?
I don't think any political party at the moment is a safe space for trans people, and it really hurts me to say that. What I can say, though, is that I'm working every single day to do what I can to make sure that LGBT people feel welcome in the Green Party. I'm from the LGBT community myself. Being gay and being trans, of course, are two different things with two different experiences, but I think it's also really important that LGBT people stick together and understand the importance of solidarity. We're seeing the rise of fascism in the far right, both across Europe, we've just talked about the Middle East, but also we're seeing it in the UK too. And ultimately, when fascists come for one of us, they're going to come for all of us. And I think it's important that minority communities all stick together. I think there's a wider point that transphobia absolutely has its same roots in anti-Semitism, in homophobia and racism. We saw a lot of this happen around the time of Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, and there were very set narratives to try and divide communities and to try and stow division within those communities. I think some people who are not transphobic have concerns about women's rights. And I think it's only right that politicians, particularly male politicians, listen to those concerns. So listening to concerns and colluding with transphobia are two very different things. I guess there's a point where those concerns become transphobic, and that's when it's important that whether you're a male politician or not, you point out that you won't have any truck with transphobia, and transphobia is not welcome in the Green Party.
But of course, transphobia doesn't go hand in hand with women's rights. So trans people are not a threat to women, of course. And obviously there's the whole debate around trans people in bathrooms. So I hear what you're saying, that it's a difficult discussion to have.
Well, can I add, because you're making a really important distinction I should have made. So I thank you for the interjection, that the threat to women's rights, whether they're trans women or cis women, is men. So the threat to women's rights is not trans women. And I think your question is really fair. And I think it is always important to point out that the problems in society through toxic masculinity need addressing, and things like the gender pay gap, the disability pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, all of those things need addressing too. And frequently the problem there, middle-class white straight men, not always, some of them are trying to make a difference in society, but ultimately systemic injustice points in that direction. So yeah, I wasn't for a second pitching women's rights and trans rights against each other. I think that's often the frame that's used, and I think it's helpful to hear that frame, but also to be really clear exactly what you just said, that ultimately men have a problem here, or a certain segment of men, not men generally, but a certain segment of men have a problem here. They're causing problems both for cis women and trans women.
We're looking at the Tories, we're looking at the Republican Party in the US. They are running to the right. But the Labour Party, supposedly a progressive party, Keir Starmer, human rights lawyer, is echoing a lot of transphobia. What is happening here when the Labour Party is supposed to be at least socially progressive in some sort of ways? Is adopting transphobic arguments?
I think there's no way at this point the Labour Party could be described as progressive. You only need to look at things like the child benefit cap. This would be the single most important measure to lifting children out of poverty. Yet the Labour leader stands with Rishi Sunak in capping child welfare at 2 children. That's disgusting. But then, yes, we look at LGBT rights too. This would be a moment for them to show some clear leadership, to stand in solidarity with trans people. They were perfectly happy, or Keir Starmer was perfectly happy to walk in Pride a few years ago. He was happy to stand with Jeremy Corbyn, who was standing on a socially progressive platform. But then as soon as there was any pressure from the right-wing media, he absolutely played into those narratives and talked about, I don't even want to repeat the tropes. I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I also think it's not helpful to amplify unhelpful words that Keir Starmer says. I guess more widely, this is somewhere where, I do support someone like Sadiq Khan, who has been good on these issues. And when Rishi Sunak was in meetings, literally laughing at trans people, Sadiq Khan was right to call that out. And I'm really proud, actually, of the London Assembly, including Conservative colleagues like Andrew Boff, who heckled Suella Braverman at the recent Conservative conference, have been steadfast on trans rights. And I think it's a demonstration that being transphobic is not a natural place for politics to go to. It's been a very deliberate place that the right have steered, both the Conservative Party, but also Keir Starmer. And I think it's deeply problematic. And I think anyone who's in the LGBT community or considers themselves an ally, just repeating "get the Tories out" is not acceptable, because you end up with a Labour government who have demonstrated themselves to be institutionally transphobic. And I think it's really important now that Keir Starmer is held to account, both on what he said, but also Labour policies, and also what he's going to say in the future. And I think unless he can say that trans rights are human rights, trans men are men, trans women are women, and non-binary identities are valid, then we have a real systemic issue, and we know we have that issue. And we've got to do everything we can to tackle it.
I want to talk about Brexit, but very, very briefly. I know how this conversation can go on for a very long time. A lot of people are sick about Brexit. I can get a bit sick about it too. But my personal opinion is, I feel the second referendum, the People's Vote, was one of the biggest political failures in my lifetime. We essentially had one route, which was a somewhat progressive Labour Party with soft Brexit. And we've ended up with an 80-seat Tory majority with a hard Brexit. Now, it's no secret that the Greens are very pro-Remain. Surely there is no path to rejoin the EU. Is that dead? Is it in the back burner? Or was that still very much part of the Green agenda?
I entirely disagree. So there was polling recently that showed, I think it was 2-1, people now think that Brexit is a mistake. Do I think we're going to join tomorrow? No, I think that would probably be toxic for the country to even start that conversation. But I do think we can rejoin when the conditions are right. So then the question is, when are the conditions right? I'd say the conditions are right when we get 4 Green MPs, we get proportional representation. And then we're looking at 70, 80, 100 Green MPs who are essentially saying, let's rejoin Europe. I think when we get that kind of mandate, then it is time to rejoin the European Union. But I think it's also really important that rejoining the European Union is not some kind of ideological kind of, we just want to be part of Europe again. People are really hurting and people are suffering. And there is a very direct link between the poverty crisis we have in this country, the way people are suffering, particularly the poorest and most vulnerable, and also those toxic narratives around migration and how we're treating refugees, and leaving the European Union.
Is that maybe to do with austerity?
I think
that could we not envision a more prosperous society outside the EU?
I think austerity is a huge part of it, but I also think Brexit amplified all of the austerity issues. So, if we rejoin the European Union but continue with austerity, then that clearly isn't going to work. That's how we got there in the first place. We had David Cameron kind of running around the country with Nick Clegg saying everything's going to stay the same if we stay in the European Union. And unsurprisingly, people who are really suffering said, I don't want things to stay the same. I want anything but the same. So I think that's the position we're in. I think it's really important that we both challenge austerity, but also that we point to the things that we've lost from leaving the European Union, the opportunities that we've lost, and also that exact social mobility point, that being able to give people the opportunities to live, to travel, to work, to love in 27, 28 different countries is really important. And I think to have strong pro-European voices, even now, when it's not on the horizon tomorrow, is really important, because it's not something we should just shut up about. This country has been robbed of all sorts of things by Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. And then in Boris Johnson's case, just left the field when it was too difficult. There's also the continuing troubles in Northern Ireland that still have not been solved around the Good Friday Agreement. So the idea that when Keir Starmer says he's going to make Brexit work, there is no way to make Brexit work. We're now 6-7 years on, and the problems are only going to get worse. So I think it's only so long before the country actually goes, things have been progressively worse since 2016. Maybe it's time to have a relook at Europe. And Europe is not perfect. I'm not someone who's there to say, Europe gets everything right. We've even seen from the Middle East conflict, Europe's position on it, I would say, has been particularly weak coming from the European presidency. But that's even more reason to be inside Europe, to be able to reform and to be able to influence those conversations.
Some people might say that it's unreformable, but I take your point about that.
I think they would say that. Some people would say the British government's unreformable, but I think you get into politics because you're convinced of the strength of your argument and the ability to be able to make those arguments.
So on a lighter note, you're a very busy man. You're deputy leader of the Green Party. You're holding Sadiq Khan to account. But what does Zack Polanski do on his day off? What do you enjoy?
I think not the day off, but the evening off. Dancing is definitely my thing. I love going to a club. I don't drink alcohol actually, but having a dance is definitely one of my big things. And I'm a huge American football fan, which is probably surprising for most people. But yeah, I'm a big NFL fan.
Well, Zack, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.